Hi everyone, thanks for stopping by. This is the series where I show my Krautrock records collection, and this is episode 3, From Hairy Chapter to Mythos. Now, if you don't like long and tedious videos, I suggest you go to my video where I flip through my records without commenting. Let's start. Let's start off with a wonderful hard-rocking band called Hairy Chapter. Hairy Chapter made 2 albums. This you are looking at, Eyes, which was their first album from 1970, and they followed up the year after with another excellent album called Can't Get Through. Now, Hairy Chapter, as I said, was in the hard rock genre. And most of these tracks are hard rockers, although there are some mellower parts, but this is a straight hard rocker all the way through, with some blues and a little bit of psychedelic leanings from here and there, but for the most part just plain hard rock. And as I said, there are no fillers on this album. And perhaps even better, the next album, Can't Get Through, which has the more psychedelic leanings and a more typical Krautrock record. This is an original for those who are interested in geeking around different issues. This is an original on the Off International label. There. Their next album, Can't Get Through, was released on the Bacillus label and is quite expensive these days. Next up we have Herderlindstrom, which was a magnificent folk rock, psychedelic folk rock band from Germany. And this is a marvelous mellow album with lovely artwork. Simply magnificent. Quite reminiscent of Bröselmaschine. And this was released in 1972 on the wonderful Pilz label. This is, as you might see, a pop import reissue. And the pop import reissues were done from the late 70s to the early 80s and are exact reproductions on the original label, except for the pop import logo. And another way to spot if it's an original or reissue is the LC code on the label, just above my thumb. The LC code was introduced sometime in 77 or 78, so that's a good pinpoint to when this reissue is from. But Herderlindstrom, wonderful psychedelic folk rock, if you like that sort of music. Next up, we are going into a more progressive jazz rock direction with Icarus, and their album from, I believe it's from 1972 or 73, 71, sorry. And this is just a marvelous piece of music. Quite accomplished musicians and very well written songs, well crafted. This is a repressing on long hair, and I recommend long hair repressings because they are always excellent pressings with custom labels, and they most often come with inserts which gives you a little bit background information on the band, some pictures. So I love these long hair repressings. And Icarus, to find an original, well, then you have to pay up, because that's quite expensive. So if you like progressive jazz rock, the only way the Germans could do it, I really recommend Icarus. Now, next up, we have a band which sold quite a lot. And it's Jane. Jane, what can we say about them? They were a sort of, in the early days, they were sort of Pink Floydish, which the kind of sound that Pink Floyd had in the early 70s. Atom Heart, Mother and so forth. But perhaps a little more edge to them than Pink Floyd. This is their first album. From 1970, I think. It's called Together. And wonderful cover art. And this is just an excellent album. On the original Brain Metronome label. This is an early pressing. And these are quite cheap to find in the wild. And not the rarest ones either, because Jane sold quite a lot of records in their day. My favorite from Jane is their second album. The cover is not so great, but the contents are just marvelous, and this is where they remind me a lot of Pink Floyd, but a little bit harder than Pink Floyd. This album is from 1971, and if you want to explore the sounds of Jane, this is a really good starting point. Even though their first album is almost equally as magnificent. This is a mid to late 70s repressing on the Orange Brain label, but the original is quite cheap to find as well. Jane's third album had the imaginative name 3, but the cover art is back to where the first album was. Excellent cover art, and they just continue what they do here. Experimental, psychedelic, progressive rock. Look at that wonderful band shot. Double Ludwig bass drums. Ah, wonderful kit. I really recommend this album as well. The last album from Jane is from, which I have in my collection, is the fourth album called Lady, which is a magnificent album as well. This one is from 1975. After this album, Lady, I find that Jane, as with many other bands, go in a more mainstream direction of either heavy rock, progressive rock or jazz rock, and sadly many of the bands sound quite alike in the later 70s, and this is not unique for Germany but for many other bands in other countries as well. But there you go, the first 4 Jane albums I highly recommend. Well, the next band needs no introduction at all. It's the legendary Craftwork, and their first album simply called Craftwork. And this is an original on the Philips label with the orange cone, traffic cone. And this is quite an extraordinary album. It hasn't seen any official re-releases on LP, as far as I know. There are many cheesy bootlegs out there on the Crown label, for instance, out of Italy. But this is the original with the gatefold sleeve. There were a couple of different issues early in the 70s. But this is the one with the gatefold sleeve and the transformator Trafo 2 in the cover, in the spread. And here you can see Ralf Hütter and Florian Schneider. And this is before Craftwork turned completely electronic. This has some traditional instruments such as the Hammond organ and the flute, and last but not least, acoustic drums. Here you can see the Philips label for those who are interested in those aspects of record collecting. This is my favorite album of Craftwork, because this is more in the experimental krautrock genre, the avant-garde side of the krautrock scene, which I find the most interesting. And with the addition of acoustic drums and other more conventional instruments with tone oscillators and tone generators, they did marvelous stuff in the avant-garde krautrock genre. And it's the famous Klaus Dinger who plays on some tracks here, and he of course later, after splitting Craftwork, founded Neu, which is another monster krautrock band. So Craftwork from 1970. I lose my interest on the second album, and actually I just have two repressings, the cheesy kinds, the bootleg kinds, on the Crown label. One is on green vinyl and one is the standard black. I don't remember which one, perhaps not too interesting, but this is where they have no drummer, so they start. This is of course the black one on the Crown label. So here they start experimenting with primitive drum machines and some early primitive synthesizers, still using those self-built tone generators, but this is a little more low-key than the first. It's an okay album, I find, but I'm not too keen on Craftwork's later work, which of course is pioneering and groundbreaking, but I'm more into the early stuff with the drums and the avant-garde side of things. So Craftwork there for you. Next up we have a wonderful guitar player, and I always seem to confuse if it was in Frupp or Frumpy, but this is Kravitz, wonderful guitar player, and this is his solo album from 1971 or 72, I think. Highly regarded prog rock, and the originals of course are quite scarce and very expensive. That's why I jumped on this repressing on the Vertigo Swirl label, and I'm almost positive that this is a bootleg reissue, but never mind, the music is fantastic. So if you like progressive hard rock with the guitar work, I recommend Kravitz's solo album. Next up we have a rarity, a Canadian musician, Mike Lewis, who went to live in Germany for a couple of years, and during his stay in Germany he released one record called Wuschel, and Wuschel is the German word for something fuzzy, as shown on the cover. Now, Mike Lewis was a guitar player, I believe, and keyboard player and drummer. He plays almost all the instruments by himself on this record, but with the aid of Connie Plank on some electronic wizardry and sounds, they too made this album. Sadly to say, I find this album quite forgettable. It's an obscurity, and I think I know why. Because the music, there aren't any highlights on this record. It's okay, but nothing more than just okay. quite expensive and rare album these days, so if you want to save up money for something better, I recommend you avoid Bushel with Mike Lewis. But then again, you might find it more interesting than I do. Next up, however, is quite a marvelous album. McChurch Soundroom Delusion. And this is a mix between acoustic and hard rocking stuff. A little bit of Eastern influences and so forth. This is released on Urvarsel Records, which specialize in reissuing old originals from the Krautrock era. And this is a mighty nice reissue. The cover is faithfully reproduced as the original. It has custom labels, which I really dig when it comes to reissues. I like either the original label design or custom labels. There are some reissue companies which have, to say the least, boring label designs. But this is a wonderful, wonderful album. I really recommend you go get this Urvarsel reissue if you don't want to spend a lot of money on the original, because they are expensive. Next up, in this fairly same vein, we have the band called Message. And this is their first album from Books and Dreams. And this is even better than McChurch Soundroom to my ears. And what's up with all the skulls? Wonderful, wonderful cover art. A little bit of occult imagery there. And the contents inside are hard progressive rock, hard heavy rock, with a little bit of Eastern influences here and there. And just a wonderful package. And this is a Bellaphon Bacillus reissue. Bacillus and Bellaphon were two giant labels of that era, and they merged into one company for some years, and now they have started doing reissues on colored vinyl and standard black. So wonderful 180 gram pressings, quality. Message released many more albums, at least a handful more albums, but this is the one to get. I also have this one from about 1976 or 77, Stay Clear. This is a boring, boring album, to my ears of course, but this is more traditional soft jazz rock, which I find hard to digest. So, from Books and Dreams, Message. This is a highly recommended record from me. Next up we have Mrs. Beastly, and they were quite early in the krautrock genre, and this is from 1970. It's a rough sound production, a little bit garagey, experimental sounding, but my god, it's wonderful. And this is also a reissue on the Garden of Delights reissue label, which I highly recommend. Everything from them is high quality pressings, custom labels, sorry, not custom labels on this one, but quite funny logo, Garden of Delights. And Garden of Delights reissues always have inserts. Here you can see the other Mrs. Beastly records, the story of the band. So quite enjoyable reissues with a lot to read when you listen to the music. I like that. Next up, we have a wonderful obscure band called My Solid Round, and as far as I know, this is their only album. And this is wonderful psychedelic krautrock. Dirty Yellow Mist, for example, the opening track on 13.5 minutes. Wonderful, wonderful, dreamy, eerie psychedelia. And look at that wonderful cover. Now, this is also a repressing, because the originals go for more than 1,000 euros. Bacillus Bellaphone record label again, in a turquoise, turquoise I believe it's called, color there. Excellent, excellent stuff. Now, the last record I want to show today is one of my all-time favorites in the kraut genre, and it's Mythos and their first album, simply called Mythos. And this is from 1972, I believe, originally released on the Ohr label, Macht das Ohr auf. And this is an Zyx Music reissue. This is a concept album about a man who sees all the sorrows and sadness of mankind and all the wars and all the bad things humanity does. So he goes to sleep for 100 years and wakes up to a peaceful world. At least that's the message I have gotten from the far out lyrics. And a standout track from this, although the whole album is simply magnificent, is Hero's Death. That's my favorite on this album. But here you have hard psychedelic rock, a little bit of Eastern influences, good musicians, and an acquired taste perhaps on the vocals, but man, I love his vocals. So this is a marvelous album. Go check out Mythos' first album from 1971 or 72. Well, if I should pick the top 5 selection of recommendation from this video or this episode, the cream of the crop, you could call it, it would be, of course, Hairy Chapter, the debut album from 1970, Ice. Be sure to check out their second one, Can't Get Through. That's a wonderful piece of music. Of course, we can't escape Craftwork's first album, groundbreaking in an avant-garde way. Jane's second album is highly on my recommendation list. Here we are. Of course, I have to choose My Solid Ground's first and only album. Quite an experimental joyride. And last but not least, Mythos. 5 superb albums I really recommend you go and check out, as well as the others, except for Message, that second album, which is a tragedy. Well, that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed watching this, please go watch my other videos, and next episode will be up soon. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.